CALPADS Error Resolution CERT132. Missing Special Education Program Record for Enrolled Student at Reporting LEA. Wait a minute, there's been an update. Flash 195 has been released. It was released on November 19th, 2020. The topics include resolving certification validation rule CERT132. It features a table with data scenarios and resolutions. So let's take a look at that flash. All right, so here's the CALPADS communications page. It's part of the larger CALPADS data portal, right? Here are all the quick links. And as you can see, CALPADS Flash 195 has been posted. Here's the flash, and we'll cover it shortly, but I just wanted to point out, also on the CALPADS portal is a link to the listserv. And if you're not getting flash messages, sign up for the LEA listserv. This is for LEA administrators, CALPADS users, and even those that are new to CALPADS, like special education data coordinators. Sign up for the CALPADS listserv so you can get the flash message directly to your email inbox. So as you can see, here's guidance from the CDE about resolving CERT132. And here are the tables, right? And these are the most common scenarios in which the CERT132 will trigger. Later on in the video, we go through each scenario, but we'll just read the title. Current LEA only adopted the triennial record, missing SPED record on or before the census day. Prior LEA did not exit the SPED record for the student who exit the special education. Plan type changes triggering even if existing reason exit date prior to census day is populated, and active IFSP transitions to no education plan, right? And so there's several different scenarios. Again, we cover this later in the video. We just want to make sure that you understand this table's out here. It's a valuable resource. If you have a CERT132 that you need to find a resolution for, first use this table as a reference. If you are new, watch the rest of the video, get a better understanding of the CERT132 and examples of these different scenarios. But as you are in the practice of resolving CERT132s, this is a great reference in addition to the error list. Now we'll watch the rest of the error resolution video. So the first step when resolving any error in CALPADS is to consult the CALPADS error list. And the two columns on the left, the error number and the error name, are used for identification. The actual problem is described in the error description. That's the third column from the left. An enrolled student at the LEA has no associated special education program record at the enrolled LEA, but has an active SPED plan. So that last part of the problem description is very helpful. Has no associated SPED record at the enrolled LEA, but has an active SPED plan. So you have to ask yourself, how does CALPADS know it has an active SPED plan, or what is an active SPED plan, okay? And so although you're not referenced in this error list, you have to go to additional documentation. And the term active SPED plan is defined in the CALPADS glossary, which is located in the CALPADS user manual. So we'll do that. That's a step that we'll have to take, but you have to have an understanding of CALPADS. Sometimes it requires a little bit of practice, but you know, you have to be analytical. You have to read into these things. Sometimes they're not as straightforward as we would wish they would be. Okay, so then the central column, fields validated, tells you where you're going to look, where you're going to make your comparison, where you're going to identify the discrepant data. So we're going to be looking at the SENR record, the reporting LEA, the SSID, the enrollment start date and the enrollment exit date. And then we're going to be looking at our special education submission and perhaps the special education history, right? And so reporting LEA, SSID, special education meeting date, student special education meeting or amendment identifier, and the education plan type code. So we'll be validating those different fields. We'll be looking at those different fields to see, one, where's the active SPED record at? And two, does the student's enrollment actually generate this error? And if so, then we have to decide what's the best method of resolution. So the error list provides us some suggested resolutions, okay? At the top of the column, it says understanding the error. When a student is on an education plan, and that means special education plan, and transfers to a new LEA, a new SPED must be submitted at the new LEA. Suggest a resolution, verify the student has not exited the program, verify the student enrollment start and exit dates at the LEA, submit a new SPED record for the student at the new LEA. And so as you're referencing documents and you see a term that you don't understand, a good place to go is the glossary in the CALPADS user manual. And we looked up active plan, and here's a definition. What's very important at the top, it says, an active plan is a plan set with no plan set end date. A plan set begins with an initial meeting and is considered active until associated SPED record or any record with the same SSID and education plan with the exit date is submitted. Okay, so we know that this is active because regardless of LEA, the student has a special education plan set, which could be one or more records that have not been exited. Okay, so that helps. And so also additional resources to look for information could be the CALPADS FAQs, the frequently asked questions. And so you may ask yourself, CALPADS is telling me that there's an open active plan. Well, why hasn't this student been exited when they left the former district and came to mine? And so there's a FAQ for this. When is it appropriate for an LEA to submit a special education program exit reason code and date for a student with disabilities to CALPADS, right? And so we highlighted the relevant information just to expedite this. It says LEAs should populate the special education program exit code and special education program exit date if the student is no longer eligible for services. That's very key, and that's really the general point when you're exiting a special education plan. Since this FAQ is written, some of these codes have in fact been retired, but they're consistent with that statement. You only exit a student from special education when they are no longer eligible for services. Transferring from one district to the next does not constitute ineligibility. Then further down, we've highlighted some other key points. LEA should not populate fields 14.49 and 14.46 for any of the following scenarios. If you're unfamiliar with those fields, that's the special education program exit reason code and the special education program exit date. Those fields would both need to be populated to exit a student from the special education program. And under those scenarios, we've highlighted transfer to another district. So it makes sense why the student has an active plan, because they've come from a different district to mine, and the guidance tells the former district that they should not exit the student from their active plan. Makes perfect sense to me. So another document when you're looking at requirements is the CALPADS file specifications. So if you're trying to make sure that data was reported accurately and correctly, you can look at the CALPADS file specifications. This particular is the DOCX version, the Microsoft Word version. And so I scrolled through it and you can see section 3.14, student special education file format. And this was chopped up. It won't read exactly the way it's displayed, because you can see that it goes from 3.14.1 to 3.14.4. I cut out 2 and 3 because they weren't relevant, but I did want you to see that in the primary key, reporting LEA or district of services there, so that would be you, right? And then further down, which is specifically relevant, is relationship to other records. And it reads, the SPED or special education program may be submitted independently of other record types. However, overlapping enrollment records, the SENR, must exist for the student at the same reporting LEA. If a child or student with disabilities has services to report, the submission of the record should be followed up by the student services record in CALPADS. So this is explicitly telling you that a SPED record may be submitted, but it must correspond with the student enrollment. We know that the student was not exited from their SPED plan because we looked at the definition of active plan. And so we know we've enrolled the student. It would make sense that vice versa, the student should have a SPED record for our district. So that you can glean a little bit information from there. And then we, of course, have the data guide. And I like to describe the data guide as the how and the why of CALPADS. Okay? It gives you a lot of instructions. It describes business rules, and it has some scenarios. And so there's a section in the special education program portion of the data guide. And if you're looking at the screen, we deliberately left a page on there so you can know where to reference. It says, when should a LEA submit special education program records for students with existing plans who are transferring from one LEA to another LEA? And so I'm not going to read it all because it's quite a novel, but the important parts have been highlighted in red. The receiving LEA must adopt previous IEP or adopt a new IEP. If the LEA decides to develop a new IEP, the LEA must adopt the previous IEP in the interim until the new IEP is adopted. If the LEA adopts the previous IEP, the LEA should submit the special education program records with the same IEP elements and the new LEA as the reporting LEA. So this is telling you that when a student comes in, you either have to access the student or develop a new IEP or adopt the existing IEP from the other district, even if it's in the interim. So there is no justification for not having a special education program record. If you have not yet developed an IEP for the student, the LEA must adopt the previous IEP. It specifically says the LEA must adopt the previous IEP in the interim until a new IEP is adopted. So there you go. And there's different scenarios. There's students transferred from an LEA, and I didn't include every scenario because, we don't have time for that. So, there's, in addition to the error list, there's several different CALPADS documents that will give you information and understanding of the expectation and how. This is the how to submit a record. This justifies you submitting a record, right? And so before you do anything to your student records, you have to understand your student data. You have to consider the reasons for the CERT132 so you know which corrections to make. And so here are a few of the reasons that are pretty common, right? The special education program record has yet to be updated in CALPADS after the SENR submission, right? So first you have to gain ownership prior to submitting special education program record. So maybe you just need to communicate with your special education data coordinator and say, okay, I've enrolled these students. You can go ahead and submit the special education program records. Maybe that's all you're waiting for. Another scenario or another reason for the CERT132 may be that you have an ineligible student that has an active plan in CALPADS and needs the SPED record to be closed. The reason why you haven't submitted a special education program record is to your understanding the student is no longer eligible. The previous district never closed their active plan. Maybe you need to contact them, right? You have to contact that LEA or that special education data coordinator and say, hey, you have an active plan. Perhaps if you cannot contact them, the prudent thing to do is to have a plan and exit it on your end. So those are things to consider, right? And then last reason that we were going to discuss is very common, probably the most common reason for the CERT132. You have a transferred student that needs to have an existing IEP adopted and reported or a new IEP reported by you, the receiving LEA. So a student transferred, CALPADS identifies that they have an active plan in CALPADS from the previous LEA, and you have failed to submit that record. And a lot of times this is because procedurally, you're waiting on an evaluation or a meeting for the student. You want to write a new IEP. What are you going to do in the interim? What are you going to do if it passes census day and you have yet to create a new IEP for the student? You have to submit a record for the student. The student is receiving services. What's the basis of those services? And that's when you are going to adopt that IEP in the interim. And then when you develop a new IEP, you submit a subsequent record. Or perhaps you amend that existing IEP. Okay? And so we're going to demonstrate how to identify the CERT132 cause and then describe what you would do to resolve this information. So just stay tuned for the demo. It's coming up. Okay, so today we're going to look at the CERT132. missing special education record for enrolled student at reporting LEA. There are 44 such errors. You click show, and those students triggering the error down here are revealed. Now we're going to blur out the SSID because we want to protect the private nature of the student data. However, I did want to point out to you that typically when you're troubleshooting certification errors for special education students, there's a special education meeting or amendment identifier, which helps you identify the record that you are troubleshooting, right? Or looking for a discrepancy in the data. Well, because that record's missing, there's no meeting amendment identifier. So all we have is the SSID. And since I have 44, I'm going to open this record in a new tab so I can preserve this page and come back and troubleshoot the rest of these errors. So I've already done that, right? And I have the student's information here. And so now I'm ready to do my comparison. I just don't know what I need to compare. I don't know how to analyze this error. So what should I do? I should scroll to the bottom of CALPADS and open up the error list. But because I do this all the time and I'm used to resolving errors, I have already saved the error list to my desktop and I actually can just drag it over here, right? So let's walk through the error list real quickly. We've identified the error using the error name and the error number, these two columns on the left. And so to identify what the actual problem is, I'm going to read the error description. An enrolled student at the LEA has no associated special education record at the enrolled LEA, but has an active SPED plan. So it's a little technical, but what it's saying is we have a student who's enrolled in our LEA. This student has no associated SPED record reported by our LEA. If this was in English, that's what it would say. But we know that the student is a special education student because there's an active special education plan in CALPADS. So there's a couple words left out. You could have phrased it differently, but this is, technical document, right? And so then the fields validated tells us where to look. So we're going to first confirm our students enrolled in our LEA, right? So that we're going to look at the student's enrollment record. We're going to confirm that the student has an active plan, right? Because it says active SPED plan. So we have to look at the student's special education history. We also are going to verify that we haven't submitted a special education that corresponds with the enrollment, right? So we're going to be looking at the enrollment history and the special education history, and specifically at these fields. And so understanding the error, because it's a pretty simple error, it doesn't go into great detail, but it says when a student is on a special education plan and transfers to a new LEA, the new special education program must be submitted at the LEA. So if special education student leaves District A and comes to District B has to submit a record for the student, okay? And then suggest a resolution. What can we do to resolve this error? Well, first we're going to verify the student has not exited the program. Perhaps the student's exited the program and doesn't need a special education record. We're going to verify the student's enrollment and start date at the LA. We want to confirm that the student is in fact our student. We want to make sure that we have an enrolled student and it was a no-show, right? We just want to make sure that we do those things. And last but not least, if we have the student who's enrolled and if they are on an active plan, want to make sure that we submit a new special education record for the student for our enrollment period. It's pretty simple, so we don't need the error list anymore. The only question I have is what constitutes an active plan? And so when you're trying to define certain things, you can go to the CALPADS user manual. In it is the glossary, but you could look up terms. Active plan. Well, that was pretty easy right there, right? Bam. Okay, so active plan. And I don't know if you guys can read it with me, but I can make it bigger. An active plan is a plan set with no plan set end date. A plan set begins with an initial meeting and is considered active until an associate SPED record or any record of the same SSID and education plan with the exit date is submitted. And so we read this because part of a student's active plan can have multiple records in different meeting types. It can have an initial, it could have annuals, it can have triennial meetings or evaluations submitted, and it's considered active until that's exited, right? And so we just want you to know it's not telling you to look at a specific record. It's looking for a record in that plan set, which would be determined by the plan type code, whether the student has IEP, IFSP, or an ISP. Until those series of records have been exited, signaling the student is no longer eligible for services, it's expected as a student transfers from district to district to have those records submitted by each LEA or those evaluations submitted by each LEA. And so we'll go back to the student's record, and we can see the student is currently enrolled at ABC Unified as of 8/31/2020. So we'll scroll down to the special education module, and I can instantly see I have not submitted a record yet. I've enrolled the student. The student's special education record from the previous LEA is open. It hasn't been closed. There's no exit date here, so I know they're active plans or active plans. They're all IEP, so the plan set didn't change. And so in that, I know that I am due to submit a special education program record at ABC Unified, and that will resolve the CERT132 error. So hopefully this is helpful to you and clear. Okay, so this is an amendment to the CERT132 error resolution recording. So many people have been getting the CERT132. That special guidance is going to be provided here very shortly. And we just want to address some of the different scenarios. Okay, so CALPADS Flash Update 193 was released, and you can see it's titled Special Education Guidance and Changes. If you go all the way to the bottom, there is information on how to report data for private school transfers for students with disabilities, right? The key here is this information is applicable to more than just private school students. The guidance given in the code T180 or the enrollment status or the school of attendance is specific to private schools. But if you read through the weeds, you can apply this guidance to any student that transfers. And typically the overwhelming cause of CERT 132 errors is a student has transferred into your district and you do not have a special education record for that student. How this error can trigger it comes in a few very different scenarios. Still, the problem is the students in your district and they do not have a IEP meeting on record, okay? So in fact, they're going to update this flash. And so the guidance that I've pulled will be added to this flash. So this flash message will be updated. And so before it gets posted publicly on the CALPADS communication site, if you sign up for the listserv, you may get it in the email. And so rarely when we do these error resolution videos, we will point to the listserv. But I'm going to do that now because if you come here and subscribe to the CALPADS listserv, you get those flash messages a lot sooner, okay? And you can see that there's a listserv for the LEA and a listserv for case Mr. CALPADS. So if you're doing special education, probably want to sign up for both the case Mr. CALPADS and the CALPADS LEA listserv so you can get the latest and greatest, okay? So I'm done with that. So here are our scenarios, but I'm not going to go over those yet. This is what's going to be added to that flash, right? These are the 5 most common reasons why you may have a CERT 132. The trigger description will tell you why it's triggering, right? Why do you get the error? And then here's a suggested resolution or a workaround. So let's talk about the different reasons. Number 1, you, the current LEA, only adopted the triennial, okay? 2, you, the current LEA, is missing the special education record before census date. So you may have the record, but it's not before census date. 3, the prior LEA did not exit the SPED record. So you have a student who is no longer eligible for special education, but because the prior district has an open, active special education plan, CALPADS thinks you are missing the special education record. Okay. 4, triggering on exit reason and exit date prior to census. Okay, so we'll discuss that here shortly. Active IFSP plan has part B that no plan, 700, 800, 900, okay? So let's talk about them one at a time now. Number one, current LEA adopted the triennial. When the only record adopted from the previous LEA is a triennial, which is an evaluation, the CERT132 may trigger due to a missing annual IEP. What you need to do is adopt the most current annual IEP before census day. So why can't you just have a triennial? Well, what's important is how we're serving the students with disabilities. And since you cannot report services unless there's an initial or an annual, the triennial evaluations are next to useless, okay? You need to have adopted the annual IEP so you can attach the services, and that will reduce LEA of the CERT 132. Missing special education record before census day. When the special education annual IEP record is submitted is after census day, there's a gap between the enrollment start date and the meeting date. Adopt the most recent annual or initial meeting from the previous LEA that is before census day. So if a student enrolls in the fall and say it's August or September, and you do give that student an IEP meeting, but it's after census day, right? This year it was October 7th. What should you do? You've already given the student a meeting. You have drafted a plan for the student to cover that gap in the interim between the start of school and census day. You need to adopt the other meeting from the previous LEA. Okay, prior LEA did not exit the special education record. When the student was exited from the special education at the prior LEA, but the annual IEP meeting record was not exited by the previous LEA, what should you do? The current LEA should reach out to the previous LEA and ask them to exit the record. Please ask CELPA for assistance if needed. LEA and CELPA contacts can be found at the LEA contacts on the CSIS webpage. 4, triggering on exit reason and exit date prior to census. When a student transitions from one plan to another, ISP to an IEP or vice versa, the CERT 132 may trigger for each plan type. Discussions will be had to consider updating the trigger logic to consider the only most recent SPED record regardless of plan type. What this is telling you is, as of right now, there is not a resolution for this error. We are discussing how to correct it. When we're talking about the trigger logic, that's the business rules that determine whether the error should trigger or not. Active IFSP plan has part B that has no plan 700, 800, 900. When a student transitions from an IFSP to a plan B initial, regardless of outcome of evaluation, 700, 800, 900, or 100, the CERT 132 may trigger for each plan type. Expectation is that the IFSP plans are exited with the code 70 once a student turns 3. However, discussions will be had to consider updating the trigger logic to consider only the most recent SPED record. So if you have a scenario where it sounds like 4 or 5, submit a service request ticket. As we are trying to determine the best way to resolve this error, guidance will be forthcoming. But if you have 1, 2, or 3, there is no reason for assistance. This video should be enough, or Flash 193. So let's demonstrate a couple of these different scenarios. Okay, so this student's triggering a CERT 132, and we're not going to walk through the steps of how to look at the error list. We've already done all that, right? We know we're looking at the enrollment record, and we can see that the student is enrolled at San Juan Unified. And we confirmed that the student has an active special education plan because we can see that the most recent special education record has no exit date. Okay, so this is an active plan. The CELPA San Juan Unified, but what's the reporting LEA? Visions in Education. So let's go back up. Reporting LEA is San Juan. The second to last reporting LEA was Visions in Education. So the most recent SPED plan belongs to Visions in Education. And so the CERT 132 is legitimate for this student because as of 7/1/2020, San Juan Unified had the student enrolled, and they have yet to adopt the IEP and submit the record to CALPADS. So all San Juan would need to do is adopt this IEP and submit the record so that the meeting date is before census day, but at their LEA. So that's scenario number one, student transferred. There is no IEP for the student that has the current enrollment. And so we just need to adopt that current IEP until we have our meeting. Okay, so on this scenario, we see the students enrolled at San Juan Unified, and we're going to scroll down, and we can see that the most recent special education meeting was at Kern County Office of Education. If we scroll over, we can see that this is an open record because there's no amendment date. So again, this student has transferred from Kern County into San Juan Unified. San Juan needs to adopt the IEP so that the meeting date is before Census Day, and that will resolve the CERT-132 for this student. So in this third scenario, again, we have San Juan Unified, and we scroll down, and we can see that the student came from Los Angeles Unified, and they reported a triennial. So what you're going to want to do if you're San Juan is adopt this second meeting from Los Angeles Unified, which is the annual, and submit that record before Census Day so you can resolve your CERT 132. And this one is a little unique because you can see the student enrolled on October 6, 2020. That's one day before Census Day. So it is highly reasonable that for this particular scenario, the meeting could not have been held upon the student's transfer before Census Day. So it's imperative that you would adopt the IEP and submit the record to CALPADS, because this is just really a 1-2 day window. You either had to evaluate or have an updated meeting with the student on the 6th or the 7th, the first 2 days of school. So, same thing occurs or same thing is required. You need to adopt the IEP as of 10/6/2020 or 10/7/2020 so that it's covered on Census Day. And not the most recent record, right? But the most recent annual, okay? And of course, anytime you're resolving CERT 32 by adopting IEP, you have to submit the associated services as well. So let's look at another scenario here. We have San Juan Unified. Again, student has been enrolled since August 7th. We're going to come down here to the special education record. It says San Juan Unified. So why would this trigger, right? Students enrolled at San Juan Unified, I have a record here with no end date, so this should be covered. Well, here's your problem. The only records are triennials. So these are evaluations. You've determined the student's eligibility for services, but how can you serve that student? You need the annual meeting to attach services, right? And so, what really the point of special education is to provide the students services so that we can limit their disability or get the most out of them. We have to report the services. So that means you have to report the annual, and the business rules support that logic. So the triennial is great. You don't have to do anything with regards to the existing records, but you have to add an annual. And that annual is going to have to be before Census Day, right? Between 8/7/2020 and Census Day on a record that you've adopted that student's IEP. Okay, so these last few scenarios, we hope help show you the variation in the CERT 132 and the method of resolving those. Again, be looking for Flash 193. There's guidance in how to enroll transferring students with disabilities in the CALPADS data guide. And again, if you have any remaining questions, please submit a ticket to the CALPADS service desk and we'll gladly assist you. Thank you.